Well, again, I want to thank you for inviting me. I'm actually in awe because I have so little knowledge about assay, and I don't want you to think that what I have to say about what we do is so erudite that it will change what you do. I think that there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration. So certainly, Connie and Michelle, clear your schedule this afternoon because I'd like to talk with you after this wonderful program is over. Well, again, thanks, Amy, for the very generous and kind introduction. I am a clinician, and I think what you'll notice when we go through our work here is that clinicians live in the numerator, and that's a problem when it comes to botanicals. One that you probably all struggle with because you really don't know the denominator of use out there, and you hope that what you see is really meaningful. But what I want to do today is give you a kind of a background from a clinical perspective and let you know what, if the Dillon is a research organization that might help influence the future of botanical safety, what we're thinking, or at least what I'm thinking. I have no disclosures, no no commercial interests or chemical interests today. And you've already seen this from Connie, and it's clear that retail sales are on the rise. And I think you're right that the COVID pandemic has had something to do with it, and we'll talk about it. But you can see here that as of 2022, the sales associated with herbal supplements has increased significantly, and there's a rapid change here more recently. And this is projected to continue up into 2030 on these market projections, where botanicals, nutraceuticals are not going away, and there are many reasons why people use these. We're not going to go through them. But very commonly used in U.S. households, most multiple vitamins, but still these botanicals and mostly the multi-ingredient nutritional mixtures are what we see most commonly consumed. Well, I want to introduce you to our work in the U.S. Drug-Induced Liver Injury Network. We're supported by the NIDDK at the NIH. And what I show you in the next series of slides will give you a bit of a background of who we are, some of the salient points that we've identified and have tried to push into the literature, what our approach is, and hopefully what you all in this opportunity for me to crowdsource think is a really credible approach for us simple clinicians to make a dent in this problem of herbal and dietary supplement-induced injury. The Dillon was established in 2003. I joined in 2007, and the number of clinical centers has changed over time, but currently in this current cycle, we have 6 clinical centers and a data coordinating center. We're up here in Philadelphia, and you can see that we're not really population-based. These are just the centers that were successful in responding to the NIH RFA, and we are somewhat of a family or clique or mafia, if you will, because we have gotten really to work closely on these topics. And of course, we do more than just focus on herbal and dietary supplement-induced injury, but it is a big concern for us. And as you can see here in the next slide, in the time trends of our cases, and this takes you up to 100% of our cases, the proportion of cases that are attributable to herbal and dietary supplements has increased. And now for the last period, 20 to 21, it's about 25% of our cases. That is, patients who sustain liver injury from herbal and dietary supplements. Now, as you already know, it's a very heterogeneous group. And so we try to simplify it for demonstration publication purposes by categorizing the products into those that seem to follow the pattern of bodybuilding supplement injury, where patients usually are young, they're otherwise healthy, they become ill and jaundiced and itchy for a very long time, and then get better and they don't die, comparing those to the rest of the products that are just a mix of a lot of things. Weight loss products, products for sexual performance, all kinds of things that are in this non-bodybuilding category. And you can see that's where we've seen the most growth. We've seen many fewer of the bodybuilding products out there. These we suspect are the anabolic steroids. But if you put it in perspective of all the products that we see that are causing liver injury among patients referred to us, herbal and dietary supplements still are the highest number of cases, followed by the antibiotics. Now, what do we see in all these herbal and dietary supplements that patients bring us and we believe cause liver injury? It's interesting as I listen to Connie that the Botanical Safety Consortium is focused on these multi-ingredient mixtures, we are bewildered by them. So we try our best to make some sense out of it. And we start with looking for the ingredients, and those ingredients which we in our experience seem to believe are emerging to the top and might be the cause of injury. And these are green tea. These are the most commonly observed dietary ingredients in the patients who come to us with liver injury. Green tea, turmeric, garcinia, ashwagandha, kratom. And you can read the rest of the list. Actually, I didn't realize that there was a blue cohosh. I always thought that it was a black cohosh. What we do when patients are referred to us with liver injury, any injury actually, is hepatologists go through a pretty iterative process to understand what's causing the liver injury, which oftentimes is nothing more than liver test elevations, blood work that's abnormal. But we go through a differential diagnosis to exclude all these things through a panoply of blood tests and imaging studies and sometimes biopsies. And once we've excluded all the various things that can cause injury, we arrive at the diagnosis of drug-induced liver injury, saying at least it's possible. But just as you face your challenges in identifying ways to understand how a multi-ingredient mixture causes injury and what might be causing that injury, we face the same problem clinically in that there is no diagnostic test for drug-induced liver injury. And so we go through a process of what's called structured causality assessment, where we go through all these possibilities to exclude them with expert opinion, where we all stand around and we try to think of all the various possibilities, and in our best experience, come up with an opinion that this is in fact drug-induced liver injury. We have a way of grading the drug-induced liver injury cases according to a level of confidence to be definite, probable, very likely, probable, possible, or unlikely. And what we call as a case that's pretty convincing is a case that is at a minimum probably drug-induced liver injury. And to us, that means more than a 50% probability. And it sounds really categorical, but there's still a lot of subjectivity in there. And in fact, the definite cases are really quite infrequent. And there are certain things which tell us that a case is definite. A patient developed injury after the exposure. There was no other cause. And the most telling thing that tells us that an agent actually definitely caused injury is they took it again and they got sick all over again, a re-exposure. What do? Well, we really also try hard in our patients who have liver injury from supplements to collect the supplement. We've been doing this since 2009. We've created a repository at my facility here, which is really not much more than a processing lab, where we collect the products from patients who are enrolled at our various sites. And we memorialize them, we save them, we freeze them, but the bulk of product we ship down to our analytical partner at the National Center for Natural Products Research at the University of Mississippi. Now, we do undergo, the products undergo an analytical process where Dr. Ikhlas Khan and Bharati Avula will verify the label when it's available, and they will run these products through mass spec and give us a library of, through analyzing it with their library, might identify some toxins, but most importantly, can verify the label content. And sometimes we've identified adulterants, pharmaceutical adulterants, through their work. We also keep that information memorialized in our own, what we call web application, as we, as researchers, work through these cases and come to consensus agreement on whether it's a drug-induced liver injury case and that a supplement is culpable. We record a lot of information in what we call our web application. It's the tool we use to assess these cases as a group. We record all the ingredients, we keep pictures, we keep the label, and more recently, because of some recent work that we've done, we take the chemical analysis data that Dr. Khan's lab has created, and now we're incorporating that into our web application for decision-making purposes. What I'm showing you here was a very small validation study because, as you can imagine, the chemical analysis information is quite confounded. They're very complex mixtures. So we ask ourselves, why do we do this, go through the expense and time, if we're not going to use it? So in fact, we ran a validation to determine if the chemical analysis was useful to a group of clinicians. Well, what we do in our usual, as I described really briefly, is we look at our cases and we come up with a scoring system of the probability of drug-induced liver injury that might be attributable, in this case, to supplements. These are the blue bars. And we took a bunch of cases that were assessed across the spectrum of scoring possibilities, and then we repeated the assessments and included the chemical analysis and tried to determine whether there really was an impact on our decision-making process by adding in the chemical analysis. And in fact, it was. What we found is that with the chemical data, we were assessing cases or making decisions with a higher degree of confidence. And oftentimes it was because we could confirm that if we were suspicious of, let's say, a green tea injury, if we found green tea or catechin in that compound, we were much more likely to give it a greater degree of probability that that product was actually the cause of liver injury. So this kind of small-scale study, which was presented in our meetings and is currently being is under review, I think, for publication, has truly shown us that we can affect how clinicians use chemical analysis data, and we're certainly using it in our research process. But it is tricky. It's tricky business, because I need not tell you that the products are complicated, and in fact, the labels are not really accurate. We did a small study, published it already in 2019 or 20, and what we found is that in the products that we ascertained, or that we collected from patients, that if you just look at the total, and these are all the general categories that we create categories so that we can make some sense out of this, whether we think a product is marketed for general health, bodybuilding, etc. And that's how we categorize these things. And what we looked at is the label accuracy. And what we found is that most labels were simply inaccurate. We actually found some products that contained information that explained the liver injury, but we didn't even implicate it. So chemical analysis, proves itself to be useful to clinicians, but it's tricky business, because if you don't have the chemical analysis, the labels are by and large a coin toss for accuracy. So what our work has done so far to clinicians and to us as researchers is that, if you remember that flow, that algorithmic approach that physicians take to come to the conclusion that drug-induced liver injury is possible, and that we've done our homework and implicated a supplement, we've come to realize that we have to consider the possibility of adulterants, unlabeled ingredients, or contaminants that might actually be the cause of the injury. Supplements are really commonly used out there, and the injuries we find are rare, no doubt. But we've also identified that the injuries that result from these supplements can be really devastating, and in fact, more severe than patients who experience liver injury from drugs. And I'm not showing you the data, but in our earlier studies, which I'm in the process of now rewriting with our updated cohort. And by the way, we've enrolled about 2,500 patients, about 600 of whom have liver injury from supplements. We found that, again, liver injury from dietary supplements is more likely to lead to liver failure and death or transplant than patients who sustain liver injury from medications. So what have we accomplished so far? Well, we've done a lot of papers. Here's some of them, starting with hydroxycut and Limbril, all the way to the more recent publications on Garcinia. And in fact, today we just received our acceptance of our paper on turmeric. I'm glad that was brought up. Turmeric is a big deal. And I want to show you actually two case studies that I hope will build the argument, a tenable argument, I hope, to this august crowd for our future strategy. So what has been our strategy? What has, you've seen some papers there, and those are just probably 75% of the papers that pertain to our work in herbal dietary supplements. There are many more papers that have nothing to do with supplements, but our strategy so far has been really empirical. And what do I mean by that? It's really ascertainment of our targets for study based upon case reports, based upon media, what's big in the media, what people are talking about, based upon our personal experience, what patients are coming to us and saying, I took this stuff and I got sick, or else I got sick and I took a bunch of stuff. And what emerges is a suspicion that then we will pursue in clusters. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by case clusters, because this really, I think, brings us to the threshold of what should be our next strategy as a clinical research organization. But I want to summarize for you some of the things that we've learned through this empirical approach, because I believe that, they're pretty important. We've learned that dietary supplements are an important cause for liver injury, and it's more severe. It can be more severe than hepatotoxicity due to drugs. We've also learned that many ingredients can cause liver injury with specific phenotypes. That is, certain patterns that if we have a patient with that pattern and a product, then with a pattern of injury that it can create that we're familiar with, that will strengthen the association that we build between that product and the patient's injury. Classical example, bodybuilding supplements, which leads to severe jaundice and itching for many months in otherwise healthy young men. That is the phenotype. In green tea extract injury, for example, it looks very much like viral hepatitis. And we're seeing that now with many of the polyphenolic compounds, such as turmeric or Garcinia. We've also learned that supplements that cause injury are very commonly mislabeled, and the context also should be given that many of the mislabeled ingredients could very well be the cause of injury. That's a hard one to prove. And finally, green tea, and as we learn other polyphenolic compounds, and Polygonum multiflorum has been published, but that injury is associated with HLA B3101, and that's important. I think important enough to display our findings. We set out to really describe our experience with green tea associated injury. And by the way, this came at a time when our relationship with Dr. Elizabeth Phillips, who's a geneticist in Tennessee, really sort of hopped on our biological samples, and we started to ask the question, as has been asked elsewhere, whether there's a genetic association with injury. What I'm showing you here is, in fact, we found that there was with green tea hepatotoxicity. And we compared our green tea cases to non-green tea controls. These are all liver injuries from dietary supplements. And what we found is that there was a prominent increase in HLA B3501 carriage in the green tea cases. And you can see that as patients had two copies of the allele, they were more likely to be judged with confidence that they had green tea associated liver injury, 2 copies being here in aqua. So this is really important, and I think gives us insight and excitement to continue on with this. And now HLA analysis has become a routine in our case series. So what's next for Dylan and dietary supplement induced liver injury? Well, it's interesting. It's actually very serendipitous, and why I want to talk with Connie and Michelle later. We are at the cusp of our next funding cycle. And there are certain, as many of you, if you respond to RFAs, that especially in the way the Dylan is funded, which is a cooperative agreement, we have certain charges, certain tasks. And among the tasks are to continue to find cases and characterize them. That's what Dylan does with clinicians. And also to understand and explore a little bit more the mechanisms of toxicity. And we do that through collaborations. Mostly, we are not a basic science group. We are not pharmacognosists. We're not, by and large, basic scientists. So we build collaborations. Hence, our collaboration is important with the Dr. Kahn's group, and hopefully can grow with the Botanical Safety Consortium. And another important aim for our next funding cycle is pharmacovigilance. And I highlight it because it's something which I think that Dylan is well suited to do. And let me give you a background which I hope will convince you, or you can crowdsource and say I'm completely misguided. But let me start by showing you a little bit of history. I'm old enough to have been around when this all came out. And this actually wasn't that long ago, so shame on me for saying that. So I was well into my career. But in 2013, we started to see something break the news about cases of acute hepatitis arising from a product for weight loss and bodybuilding. And this was in November of 2013. And then, of course, things like that hit the media not too much later. Fat-burning supplements linked to liver failure. And then soon after that, the first scientific publication from a colleague of mine, Marina Reutman. And Dr. Reutman and her colleagues in Hawaii made the observation, quite serendipitously, of about 8 patients who developed liver failure after taking a newer formulation of this product called Oxyelite Pro. Already this product was acted upon by the FDA because of cardiac toxicity, and it was reformulated, put back on the market, but hepatic toxicities then arose. And the authors reported this, Dr. Reutman and her colleagues reported this to MedWatch and also to the CDC, which then got the Hawaii Department of Health involved, and that ultimately led to an investigation by the CDC and the Department of Health in Hawaii, which then showed the association between Oxyelite Pro and liver failure. And eventually, the FDA deemed this new formulation and other products that contained agiline, which we won't get into, but adulterated, and banned the sale in August of 2013. This publication actually came out in 2014. But the point here is that it was really based upon the astute clinicians who recognized this cluster of cases, which caused them to say, hey, something's wrong. And it was then pushed up the chain, and it became managed as an outbreak, as we would a COVID outbreak for that matter. Well, in the Dillon's work, we've done similar things, perhaps not quite as timely. Rather, more retrospectively, we can look in our case logs and identify that we too have been identifying clusters, or could have identified case clusters. And I want to highlight 2 of them. One is turmeric, as curcumin. This is and what we saw is during the course of our years in action, we saw a spike in our turmeric cases, or again, patients who presented with liver injury that were taking turmeric-containing compounds. And not an enormous number of cases, highlighting that these really are rare events. And similarly with kratom, where we saw a spike more recently. I want to focus on turmeric. Many of you probably cook with it. You certainly enjoy it. When I started to target this, my wife was really upset about it because we love turmeric in the household. And I promise you, we are not going to torpedo turmeric. But something is up with turmeric. And it was first published in 2021, the first, I think, credible case series in the British Journal of Pharmacology, that there was an acute liver injury that seemed to result from turmeric, and not insignificant. These ALTs, the most important liver enzyme, as you can see, significantly higher than normal. And that seemed to be the pattern. And some patients were quite ill with very elevated bilirubin, perhaps dose-related. Well, we have Dillon cases of turmeric-associated liver injury. I kind of showed you that graph. There were 14, and this is now turned into a publication. Our patients were mostly female, age 55, with a long latency, which means that many people were taking this for a very long time before they got ill, but some became very ill with really high liver enzymes and jaundice. And interestingly, about 50% showed this positive anti-nuclear antibody, which suggests that there might be an autoimmune basis. Well, I already showed you the timeline of our cases, which seem to spike in the more recent years. Why? Well, that's an important question, and I think Connie touched on that, and we think it has to do with COVID-19. Now, when you go and look around for the things that people have been taking for COVID-19, a lot of things show up, right? And for what is their evidence-based value? Maybe vitamin D, but that's about it. But nonetheless, when you look at the various reasons why people use supplements or use them during COVID, improving immunity was one of them, as well as looking at, trying to improve overall health and wellness. And if you look at the various supplements that were used, well, COVID is right there. It's one that perhaps wasn't the greatest increase in use during the COVID pandemic, like ginger and honey, but certainly it was in the top 10 of agents that were used. So what do? Is we as clinicians say, well, maybe the spike that we see in our few cases, we start to triangulate information and look at this and say, well, maybe this was the COVID pandemic. Because as you know, we can't go to any database or any reliable, or I shouldn't use that term, but any easily and readily available database that tells us what the denominator of use of products out there to really say that the incidence of injuries from turmeric is really increased in the population. But we continue the process of triangulation. What I'm showing you here are the adverse event reports from the FDA, the CARES CIFSAN database. And as you know, most products are multi-ingredient. So with the database that we now receive from the FDA, and I presume you all can access, we simply search for all the products that contain turmeric, and we see similarly kind of, I guess we could convince ourselves that this is a bit of a spike. It's 2 cases here during the COVID pandemic. So now I want to, with that background, show you a bit about our work, in Kratom, and hopefully bring this story together. Kratom is something that we have seen as well, and it's an opioid-like product that we have that has been published and has been used to as a sedative, as an anxiolytic. It's being used also that people are using to help them wean from their opioid addiction, for example. This is what it looks like. Retragina speciosa, I'm sure I've said that wrong. And this is what the cases look like. These are our Dylan patients. Actually, I should update this slide, but because this is presented at a time when we hadn't completed our work. But by and large, what these patients have is a liver injury that is marked by an elevation in the ALT, but also we see that patients have an elevation in the bilirubin. This is not exactly like what we see with green tea and turmeric and the other polyphenols. This is a bit more of a mixed picture. But again, we ask ourselves, well, why are we seeing these cases? Well, if we look at why Kratom is being used, it's being used for its opioid side effects or to help wean from opioid. And we go to where we might get reasonably credible information on where else might people be seeing these exposures to Kratom. And we go to the National Poison Data System for annual reports of Kratom exposure. And by and large, we're seeing the very same pattern. Of course, this stops at 217, but we're seeing the same pattern in the poison data system as we've seen in our Kratom. So these 2 case studies, if you will, I hope build a rationale, and I hope I've convinced you, build a rationale that the Dylan can serve as somewhat of a pharmacovigilance tool. That is, to identify products that might cause liver injury. And Connie, I hope maybe you did it to be kind to me, but it was wonderful to see that you've listed hepatotoxicity as the top of your targets. But I believe that the Dylan can serve a good purpose in accomplishing pharmacovigilance for dietary supplement-induced liver injury. Now, there are certain things which confound pharmacovigilance, and we've got 10 minutes left by my clock, so we'll make it. But pharmacovigilance, and I'm not a pharmacovigilance expert. I've read about it as much as maybe you have, so there are people in the audience who know much more. So this is a very pedestrian view of pharmacovigilance, but still one that, in my assessment, for dietary supplements is heavily confounded because we don't have predictive analytics as we do in pharmaceuticals, to predict, well, a drug might more likely cause injury in the elderly population, for example, or in people who have liver injury. We don't have that in dietary supplements. We also don't know the denominators of use. So from a pharmacovigilance perspective, we can't know what that denominator is to know whether there really is an increase in incidence of injury or we're just seeing a population phenomenon. Likewise, we don't have the benefit of large pharmacovigilance databases for data mining. We also, I think, don't have robust post-marketing surveillance in these products. Arguably, you might think that is the case because drug manufacturers do engage in post-marketing surveillance very heavily to prove that any adverse events in the large grand scheme of things are justifiable based upon the drug's pharmacodynamics. That is to say, if a few people get sick due to a drug, but a majority of patients overwhelmingly are cured of cancer or of a devastating disease, that risk-benefit analysis is really helpful in marketing a drug. We can't know that with dietary supplements. And finally, the consistency and completeness of reports, and I'm sure that could be argued for drugs as well, is really sometimes kind of ramshackle. And if many of you have read the reports that come through the FDA, and of course it's no fault of theirs, there is not a lot of good source information there. So, but that being said, pharmacovigilance for dietary supplement-induced liver injury does have some benefits. Media attention, right? That's how we've identified many of our case series, because, we have high-profile cases that hit the news. There are compelling stories that come with these. I could show you many pictures of people who were jaundiced, who hit the airwaves and end up on the web. There's also this concept that I have extracted from the literature, particularly in pharmacovigilance, of patient centricity. Now, in pharmacovigilance, case reports are critically important, and the quality of those reports are really important, which is one of the things that I think, have a great strength in, and that's creating really good, well worked up cases. Patient centricity could probably mean a lot of things. To pharmacovigilance experts, it probably means that we have a patient engaged, can get great source information, we can engage the patient, build trust with the patient that the information they give is actually going to mean something. Well, the Dylan actually can build that patient centricity. We also have multiple data sources, and I've just showed you some. In looking at Kratom, we have not only the Dylan, we have the poison control information. And in turmeric, I've shown you market data as well as the Dylan, and who knows, I did not look at the patient source information, but we also have the CARES database. And we have engaged stakeholders, and I'll show you some of them. Certainly the Dylan is engaged, and I hope I could consider that the Botanical Safety Consortium and its leadership might be an engaged stakeholder here. Also, we have an emerging understanding of susceptibility factors, specifically the HLA. Now that's also has to be taken with a grain of salt. There are probably a lot of people out there who are HLA-B3501 positive. That doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't take green tea extract. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. But we also do have an emerging understanding of susceptibility factors and much to learn about that. So when I talk about pharmacovigilance and try to convince my colleagues in the Dylan that we should engage in it, I think the Dylan has a strength in case reporting. We come up with cases that are really well worked up, and we follow patients through to the conclusion or resolution, or sadly sometimes death and liver transplant. We need partners for signal detection. Detecting a signal is more than just one case maybe, or maybe one case is enough. But we do have experts that we engage with, particularly the FDA, for signal detection, and formally as well. We also are not, as a Dylan research organization, built for hypothesis testing. That is, once we identify an adverse event and feel pretty confident it's a signal, we're not equipped, although we may have, we think, the expertise to do it, we're not equipped nor funded to go the distance to perform case control studies to confirm that association. Herein lies the need for yet another partner, and the CDC is a wonderful partner for that, and we're building that relationship. And finally, information management. Information management in that what we identify as a signal should get to the public in some way, and should get to other stakeholders so that we can put our findings in better context. For example, market data. There are organizations, many of whom are involved with the Botanical Safety Consortium, like the American Botanical Council, where we can get valuable market data to put our findings in context. The Office of Dietary Supplements, and I've reached out to all, because therein lies another source of information that we could, that could be an outlet for what we find. And now, as I learn more and more and listen, the Botanical Safety Consortium, because we're not finding individual ingredients as we write about. We write about individual ingredients, we post them in Liver Talks, but let's face it, most of what people take and what's causing injury are multi-ingredient mixtures. And although we think that we will dabble in some in vitro testing of our products, all of these products are multi-ingredient mixtures. So therein lies, I think, the possibility of overlap and collaboration, because the products we get, we believe, cause liver injury. Turmeric is just one example I'm showing you here. Liver tox, I hope many are familiar with. Liver tox is a compendium of all pharmaceutical agents that have caused hepatotoxicity. It's great for clinicians. We refer to it often. The portion that is of botanicals is somewhat nascent, but growing. Turmeric is in there, green tea, and several others. Dr. Jay Hufnagel from the liver branch of the NIDDK is really the champion of populating these, and it's, of course, peer-reviewed. Well, I'm glad that when I saw what Connie showed, because I've shown this to my colleagues, that what we do really has direct relevance to the public health. And I think that, and consumer safety. And I think that the Dillon now has collected enough information and is at the cusp of dabbling in something like pharmacovigilance that we really can impact the public safety. And in the 25 years since Congress passed the DSHEA, maybe one would say not a lot has happened to positively impact consumer safety, but it appears now with this and the endorsement of the BSC, I think we are at the cusp. And clearly that goes outside of the US as well and into Britain. Well, let me just finally say, once again, thank you, Connie and Michelle and Helen. I hope all's okay, for inviting me, for Amy, for the kind introduction. I've learned much from just the first opening talk. The Dillon's future will be founded in case finding and characterization of the cases, the clinical characterization, and in collection of the products that we suspect cause liver injury. We're going to focus more and more on the mechanisms of toxicity and risk factors, and herein begins the overlap, I hope, with the BSC. And my particular feeling is that we are now poised to focus heavily in pharmacovigilance, because when we triangulate our information with all the other things out there that we might find in the public domain or with various stakeholders, I believe that in fact we may have an opportunity to identify clusters of injury early, to protect the consumers, and also to feed information and function as another inlet of information for the Botanical Safety Consortium to study these complex mixtures. Thanks all very much. I'll stop, and hopefully there's some comments or questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Victor. This is a fantastic talk. I really appreciate you giving it to us today. Definitely happy to set up a time to chat and see how we can collaborate and move forward. I will go through, there's quite a few questions. We'll do a couple for time. There were a couple comments about turmeric or curcumin. One from Stefan Gaffner from ABC said that a majority of the patients with liver injury in the cases from Italy were taking products containing synthetic curcumin, hence not turmeric, and piperine, a no CYP3A4 inhibitor. How do you know that the effects are actually due to turmeric, the powder extract of the plant, is his question.
Excellent question, and I have no idea. You know, this is a problem where we need chemists, and who would then take that turmeric and really prove that it was the cause by giving it to the patient in the same or high quantity? That's an excellent point.
Mm-hmm. Similar question, I'd say, from Sydney Sudberg from Alchemist Labs, asked about knowing if something reported is actually due to the botanical itself versus an adulterant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, again, great question that I can't answer. You know, again, this is where we need to build collaborations with people like you who can help us here. Now, you know, when we have an obvious adulterant, let me give you an example, and we might have some confidence here. One example is, and I'm not showing you the case, but it's a case I often boast about. It's a patient who was taking a product. The product was tamoxiclone, and it was a bodybuilder who was taking it. And we had just begun our endeavor to collect product and analyze them. And our analysis consisted of the HPLC with mass spec, and we could identify nothing that was in the label. But what we did identify through this study was a pharmaceutical adulterant, tamoxifen, which makes sense. As an anti-estrogen, bodybuilders might take this to prevent breast growth. And in fact, the liver injury that we saw in this case was exactly what has been described with tamoxifen or some injuries. So in that case, we draw the conclusion of an association, but it is not a proof. It is not a proof.
No, I appreciate that, Victor. Looking at time and there's a lot of similar themes in the questions. I think the last one I'll ask is from Marjolaine Wildwater from the Voltes. She asked, if you would take the different herbal products and their dilly-causing effects in patients, could you conclude that certain groups are more sensitive, or is it just some percentage of the overall population?
If we knew the population of users, I could ask your question, but it is so very insightful. And we have tried to, I've proposed studies to understand what other factors might impact the development of injury in what otherwise might be, commonly used innocuous products. Is it the volume, the amount of people? Is there a dose response? And we have not been very successful in determining whether there's a dose response relationship in many of our studies. Green tea is one. Is it a host factor? We come up with this relationship of green tea injury, and actually seen in several polyphenolic injuries with the genetic association. So that's another. Another issue which I'm suspicious of are behaviors, whether there's a certain behavior which might predispose to injury. An example is people use a lot of green tea products for weight loss. And we know that at least in vivo models, that if green tea or catechin is given on an empty stomach, the pharmacokinetic exposure is much higher. So maybe people who tend to take this are fasting and they're more likely to develop liver injury. I've not been able to get that study off the ground because of the complexity and the need for controls. That's a circuitous way of answering your question. Like I've answered all the rest. I don't know.
No, I think that's all right. Sometimes it's nice to have these discussions for what needs to be done in the field. And I could see that too. Some of the work we're doing maybe could fill in some of those mechanistic gaps. So I really appreciate this talk today, Victor. Let's definitely stay in touch and see where we can harmonize. Thank you very much.
Thank you.